Hello, I'm Shannon Tiezi from the Diplomat, and I'm happy to be here today at the United States Institute of Peace, where I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Wilder. Dr. Wilder is the Vice President for South and Central Asia Studies here at USIP. Dr. Wilder, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for coming.
On June 14th, Afghanistan held the long-awaited runoff election between its two remaining presidential candidates, Abdullah Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani. The election, unlike many had feared, proceeded fairly smoothly without a lot of violence. Dr. Wilder, obviously the big concern for this election was, would it be safe? Was the Taliban going to disrupt the process? And both this election and the initial April election were largely smooth without any major incidents of violence. How much should we read into this about the Afghan security forces' ability to handle Taliban opposition?
Yeah, well, first of all, I had the privilege of being in Afghanistan for the first round of the election. Indeed, it ended up being much more secure than I think many of us had feared, as did the second round on June 14th. And I think the security, there's a number of factors for it, but it did, I think, lead to tremendous outpouring of support for the Afghan National Security Forces for protecting the voters on election day. It was fun to see on social media in the days after the first round, for example, girls going around handing roses to the police in Kabul for protecting them on election day. So I think it was both good for the morale of the troops themselves and the police force as well, but also for the Afghan people to have more confidence in their own security forces. But I think it's important to highlight that, let's not forget that there's still a large international troop presence there who did play an important behind-the-scenes role. We still have more 30,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan who did play an important role. So I think whereas definitely Afghan National Security Forces took the lead, they were supported. And that's where I think a lot of Afghans are concerned that support for the security forces needs to continue, for Afghanistan to stay stable.
Well, turning to the elections themselves, we won't know the results for some time, but there's some initial speculation that most of the voting proceeded along ethnic lines. Do you think that ethnic tensions are going to be a problem for whomever is eventually declared the winner?
Well, ethnic politics are certainly a reality in Afghanistan, but certainly in the last decade we've seen it become more complex. It's not just simply ethnic-based voting. Again, in the first round of the election, which took place on April 5th when I was in Afghanistan, Dr. Abdullah, who is perceived to be aligned a bit more with the Northern Alliance and non-Pashtun groups, although technically his father was a Pashtun and so he is a Pashtun, but he did actually quite well in terms of securing Pashtun votes in the South in the first round. The second round, it's too early to say what the results will be, but preliminary indications do suggest that there might have been a bit more mobilization of Pashtun votes and that we might end up seeing more ethnic-based voting in the second round of the election.
Mm-hmm. Now, both candidates have already raised concern about fraud being portrayed in this election. Do you think that there's a possibility that whoever is declared the loser could challenge the result? And what would this mean for the legitimacy of Afghanistan's government?
Well, we already know they're challenging the result. In particular, Dr. Abdullah has made very serious criticisms of the election. He is very critical of the Independent Election Commission and the Independent Electoral Complaints Commission, as well as of President Karzai. And has asked his observers to withdraw from the counting process, has made lots of demands. So already it's becoming quite controversial. And no doubt again that there's been fraud. The first round of the election, we also saw significant levels of fraud. However, compared to the 2009 presidential election, where there was massive fraud, the perception was, the overwhelming perception, I would say, was that the 2014, the first round was better than the 2009 election. And the key issue now, though, is that, undoubtedly, in an environment like Afghanistan, where you have an active insurgency taking place, weak institutions, there's going to be problems. That's to be expected. But the big question is now, how are they going to be resolved? And we have electoral laws in Afghanistan that lay out what needs to happen, which is that collect your evidence. If you have complaints to make about the election, file those complaints with the Independent Electoral Complaints Commission, and let that process play out. I am personally a bit concerned that we not too quickly jump to conclusions that it was all fraudulent and that the institutions are completely biased and discredit them, because frankly we don't have much other than the process to stick to ultimately lead to a legitimate outcome. And if you say the electoral institutions, you're not going to accept their result, well then how are we going to reach a result? And it's critically important for this election to lead to a legitimate successor to President Karzai, and for this political transition to take place, I think for the international community to remain engaged in Afghanistan. So again, I would urge all the candidates and the parties to sort of calm down a little bit, absolutely investigate fraud, provide your evidence to the appropriate bodies, but then let that process play out rather than demonstrating, creating civil unrest, which last thing Afghanistan needs is something. Already we have the insurgency destabilizing it. We don't need a big civil unrest movement to further destabilize the country.
And regardless of who eventually emerges the winner, both Abdullah and Ghani have indicated that they would be willing to sign the bilateral security agreement, which would provide a way for U.S. troops to remain in Afghanistan post-2014. How do you envision the future of U.S.-Afghanistan relations under the new president?
Well, there I'm really optimistic. I mean, I think, we've had, as you know, a very troubled relationship with President Karzai for the last several years. He's been a difficult partner. Some would say not a partner at all. And both the candidates who, both Dr. Ghani and Dr. Abdullah, I think do want to rebuild that relationship with the United States and the international community. Both have indicated they'll sign the bilateral security agreement. And I think it's really important. They're both very clever individuals and know that their political survival to some extent is going to depend on that, and keeping the international community led by the U.S. engaged in supporting Afghanistan. And I think this is where, let's learn the lessons from the past, which is, when we disengaged too quickly from Afghanistan after the Soviets withdrew, it led to a disaster, both for Afghanistan and ultimately for America. And, it's certainly a very plausible situation that if Afghanistan falls apart again, it could once again very quickly become a safe haven for transnational terrorist groups, very quickly could further destabilize Pakistan, which we shouldn't forget is the fifth largest nuclear power in the world, which has a long-standing, rivalry with its neighbor India, which also has nuclear weapons. So it's a very, potentially unstable part of the world. And, I think it's in U.S. national interest to remain engaged. And I think both the candidates, whichever one wins, will be a strong partner, or certainly a much stronger partner than we've had moving forward. So I'm hoping a new face leading Afghanistan, who, is much better at expressing gratitude for some of the support that's being provided, but also becomes a good partner, will increase the prospects that the U.S. and the international community will maintain the commitments that they've made not to abandon Afghanistan, which I think really would lead to a disaster.
And of course, Afghanistan's security is not entirely in its own hands. There's also a lot of discussion about the role Pakistan needs to play to keep Afghanistan secure. There's been a lot of talk about Pakistan's willingness or lack thereof to really go after the terrorist organizations that are up in its tribal regions near the border. And after the attack in Karachi airport in Pakistan, we're starting to see a little bit more movement on that front from Islamabad. Do you think that this is going to continue? Is this a real effort? And if so, is it actually going to help stabilize Afghanistan?
Pakistan's a difficult one to predict. I think a lot of us have been hoping for a long time that Pakistan would recognize that there isn't such a thing as good terrorists and bad terrorists. And so they've had a fairly complex policy, and certainly in my estimation, the need to recognize that for Pakistan's own good, they need to crack down on these groups and not sponsor, facilitate the Afghan Taliban in particular to destabilize neighboring Afghanistan. And I've recently traveled to Pakistan, and my sense is that there is now a growing fear of what's going to happen in Afghanistan once U.S. troops pull out. And currently the schedule is for nearly all of them to pull out by the end of 2016. And there's a fear that if then Afghanistan falls apart, there could be big refugee flows into Pakistan that could destabilize Pakistan even further. So I'm actually cautiously optimistic that Pakistan is getting a bit more concerned, I think, about this, and interested in stability in Afghanistan, because they realize the negative impact that's going to have on Pakistan. And I think this North Waziristan operation, which they just launched in the last few days, I think that's going to be interesting to see. I mean, do they only try to target the Pakistani Taliban, or are they also going to take on some of the groups like the Haqqani network, which up until now the perception is that Pakistan has protected and not really actively gone against. And I think that will be one indication, I think, of what their intent is in terms of support for the Afghan Taliban moving forward. But this is a critical time, and I think that this is also where the international community needs to continue to work with Pakistan to get them to recognize the need that there aren't good Taliban and bad Taliban.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's more than just Pakistan, more than just the U.S. All the regional players are very concerned about the future of Afghanistan, particularly China, which shares a border with Afghanistan, and India as well. Do you think that we're going to see international, or at least regional, multilateral efforts to help secure Afghanistan?
We should, because everyone has a very common interest in seeing Afghanistan be stabilized and not fall apart. And so ironically, we're in a situation right now where I think Pakistan has made clear they would like to see U.S. troops remain in Afghanistan. China would love to see U.S. troops remain in Afghanistan. The Russians would love to see U.S. troops remain in Afghanistan. The Central Asian states would like to see that. Even Iran, although they wouldn't say it publicly, I think secretly probably wish for that as well, because of the fear of what will happen if the international presence decreases too quickly in Afghanistan for stability in Afghanistan. So I see this as an area where we can get consensus. I mean, there's the potential for consensus. Up until now, each actor continues to often Pakistan does things because I think India's, involved, and the Saudis maybe get involved because I think the Iranians are involved, and but I think we really need to get back, and I'm hoping that the collective interest in a stable Afghanistan will create opportunities for a regional approach to supporting a peace process in Afghanistan moving forward. Because I think there is now a real recognition that there isn't a military solution in Afghanistan. Ultimately, there has to be, an inclusive peace process and a political process that leads to a more sustainable peace.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Wilder.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for tuning in. Once again, I'm Shannon Tiezi from The Diplomat.